Hi, it's John, and I'm actually quite excited today and fascinated to be joined by author James Waterson. He's written a book a few years ago that I found really fascinating as it dives into a number of interesting historical discussions that tie together politics and religion and murder, of course, as well. So without further ado, I want to welcome James Waterson.
Hi there. I am James Waterson, the author of the Ismaali Assassins, one of a long chain of people who have written about them. And it was an interesting project because really what I wanted to bring to the table were the factors that actually caused the evolution of the sect, the way that they operated within Islam and actually survived some of the greatest onslaughts of the Mongols and of the Turks and even of the Crusaders. Eventually being extinguished by the Mongols, but still they survived today in a modern, much more pacifistic form. But equally, what it really shows us about the Islamic world was how what was brought into being by the Islamic conquests created not only a great field of trade all the way from India right across to southern Spain, but also the ability for individuals to move freely throughout that area. Which was plus in many ways. It created an extremely rich empire very rapidly on the ruins of two, but equally the security aspect, and you see it in the writings of the time that there were fugitive preachers of the Ismaili sect being pursued. We get secret agents thrown in there. We get roadblocks thrown in there. We get the short bit of prison time here and there. We get a few double agents now and again, and of course, as you say, we get the spectacular killings. And I think that's really one aspect that comes out again and again with these individuals. That though they were, I would suggest, they've often been called, early day terrorists, but for me, the terrorists of the medieval age were in fact the Mongols, who used mass destruction, torture, absolute desolation of the land to inflict terror, not just the fact because they could, but because it was actually a weapon of psychological warfare, of making sure that people collapsed before. When you look at the Ismailis, you actually have quite a moral bunch of killers, really. Despite the fact that there were so many child rulers in the region across Islam at the time, they never actually took the life of a single child ruler. They never took the life of a woman. And their attacks were very limited in terms of collateral damage. We're not talking about our 21st or 20th century definition of terrorism, bringing down an entire plane full of people or planting massive bombs in the center of London or attacking Twin Towers in America to create massive amounts of damage and terror that way. We're looking at really a systematic approach. And it also wasn't unusual for these gentlemen, if they came across a particularly stubborn Sunni preacher who was preaching against the Shia Nizar Ismaili creed, to bribe him, to give him a large gift of payment, but also with quite a pointed letter to say you really should cease and desist what you're doing. And that worked a lot of the time as well. And I think the other thing that comes up in terms of these guys being in some ways modern is asymmetric warfare. I think that the assassin grandmasters, certainly the early ones, Hassan I Sabah being the first, really comes to mind. They understood very well that they were up against a huge empire. We hear stories of the Turkish rulers of Baghdad being capable of bringing 150,000 cavalry to the battlefield, that it took 2 or 3 days sometimes for their army to be shipped across rivers and seas. It was so vast. But the assassins obviously had a very, very small pool of manpower, which means that they really did work it out very, very quickly. When you're up against it, what are your options? Well, Frederick the Great always said that fortified places are a great thing, but the problem with fortified places is they need relief. So fortified places like castles, if you're a crusader, you've got a field army. Well, until Saladin destroyed the Crusader field army at Hattin. But assassins had very small numbers of people available to them. The sect as a whole was small, but even then, the fidei, the actual assassins themselves, the people who would have the daggers and try to get in close and then kill their target, were even less. So what do? Well, you go to a castle strategy where you can lock up and you can make sure that that 150,000 cavalry army sits below your castle, slowly running out of fodder for the horses, running out of morale, probably running out of supplies as well. And to be honest, if your army is full of Turkish warlords, great soldiers, but a little bit on the rough side sometimes, they're not very interested in taking a castle that has no plunder, no booty, no nothing in it.
Makes sense.
So our assassins, thinking this through, think, okay, we're going to have the castle, we're going to bog these guys down, we're going to keep them there, but how are we going to do that relief part that Frederick the Great talks about? Fortified places, again, need to be relieved. Well, what you do is you kill the general, or you kill the sultan, or you kill the vizier, the grand minister. And again, certainly the most spectacular, the one that really starts it all, was the destruction of the complete empire, an empire that ran all the way into Central Asia, all the way across Baghdad, all the way into Syria, and nearly to the edges of Egypt. The Seljuk Empire is destroyed by one carefully timed dagger. Nizam al-Mulk, the grand minister of the empire, was stabbed as he was leaving work one evening. Well, I say he doesn't leave work like you and I leave work. He was leaving work on a litter, being carried. He was on his way to his harem. He was probably thinking about the things. Yeah, some good things are going to happen that evening. I mean, the man works hard, remember. He's created pretty much an entire empire. Because the Sultan is a warrior, Nizar al-Mulk really was a Persian-Turkish bureaucrat. So he's on his way there, and an assassin appears in the guise of a holy man. He leans forward to offer a blessing to Nizam al-Mulk, and then he stabs him to death immediately. The killing fractures the empire in a second because of mutual suspicion within the royal family, within the bureaucracy. The Sultan died not too long after, probably of natural causes. That only increased the paranoia. But without that great minister to actually regulate the empire, the problem with medieval polities in many ways is they are family firms. I mean, Trump's just left office. That looked a little bit like a family firm running a country, but it doesn't generally happen, right? But in the medieval age, who could you rely on? Only really on kith and kin. The other problem is Turkish, and I'm talking Central Asian Turks here, the way of inheriting what your father had if he's the Sultan, not one son gets it. It's a patrimonial share out. Lots of different sons, they all get an equal share. Problem is too, they've often all got different mothers because of polygamy. So what you find immediately as this empire loses the Sultan, I think the Sultan's wife, if I remember correctly, died shortly after too. Nizam al-Mulk has been killed by the assassins. It fractures, it goes straight into civil war. The civil war didn't end, let me just count this out, 1092. They were still pretty much fighting it until 1105. So 1092 to 1105 for about 13 years, and it sputters on for a little bit longer than that as well. You've got Turkish emirs like Tutush, the great emir of Syria. He returns to Baghdad to try his arm. I think he was the brother of the Sultan, if I remember correctly, against the Sultan's son, Bergerac. They fight over Baghdad forever. Lots of Turkish emirs or lords get pulled into that because it's very lucrative. They're being paid very well. They leave Syria exposed. It's wrecked. Tutush dies in battle against Bergerac. Syria is there with two of his sons, very immature sons, Ridwan of Aleppo and Maldud of Damascus. And who turns up? The Crusaders. The Crusades turn up just as Syria has been completely detached from the Islamic Empire, completely isolated, very, very weak. It's already been kind of wrecked by a war between the Turks and the Fatimids of Egypt. And now it's completely disintegrated politically. There's been a few bad harvests as well. So the timing, by pure luck, of the First Crusade, I am fairly confident the First Crusade would not have succeeded, would not have taken Jerusalem. We would not have had a Latin state in the Middle East for nearly 200 years following until 1291 if it hadn't have been for that assassin's blade. Now, you could claim this is just, the wings of a butterfly causes a tsunami or whatever the Japanese idea is. But I think it also shows the fragility of that state. Interestingly enough, back to the Crusades, but a little bit further down the line, who did the assassins fail against? They actually failed very badly against the Crusaders. They carried out some very high-profile murders of Crusaders, but because of the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitalar, who were the main military bulwark of the Crusades, it doesn't matter if you kill the Grand Master, because it's an elected position. It's not hereditary. The Templars and the Hospitallers were celibate. They were not married. They were a brotherhood. Same with the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt that comes to power in 1250. They're Turks. They're manumitted slaves, so they were slaves imported into the empire. They're then given their freedom. They undertake military training, a very, I would say, not perfunctory knowledge of Islam, but a very rigid soldier's Islam. Nothing fancy, no complex theologies, very straightforward, absolutely dedicated to a life of war. Probably the finest soldiers of the medieval age, spending their life in the saddle, shooting the bow. They say that they used to do 500 sword strokes every day onto a bed of lead just to keep the strength in their arms. But also, this is a pyramid. When a Mamluk Sultan is again elected by the emirs and he comes to the top of the pyramid, his sons, if he has sons, automatically cannot be Sultan, in theory. A few strong sultans who manage to put a few sons on the throne. But generally speaking, you've got this pyramid of strength. Emir. You have Mamluks of 100, Mamluks of 1,000, Mamluks of 10,000, then the Sultan at the top. So you can take him out, but the state's not going to disintegrate. Not like these family firms. I'm sorry, I've been talking at length, though I get carried away sometimes.
I didn't want to interrupt because you're giving me all sorts of things I want to pick up on. Maybe to just pause for a minute, I want to get into asking you about your personal background so people have a bit of better idea where you're coming from and your level of expertise, because these are really very complicated topics from quite some years ago, and you're drawing on a number of different important themes, not only from history, but economics and politics and warfare. Before I dive into more questions, maybe James, could you tell everybody what your background was and how you became an author in particular?
Probably almost accidentally, to be honest. My history degree is from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, University of London. And I remember still being an undergraduate, and the opening speech from the dean was essentially, we are sometimes called the School of Obscure and African Studies, or Obscure and Arcane Studies, because whilst most people have studied in the West, in Europe, I'm English by origin, study Western history, they study British history, 20th century, or they study Second World War, or in the US, they might study Vietnam and so on and so forth. It's quite rare for anybody to get a high school education in Asian studies. So we were set a mission. We were set a mission that we should go out like little proselytizers, like little preachers, and tell the world about this other world that's out there, whether that's South Asian India, whether that's East Asian China, whether that's Islam, whatever. In fact, I went to SOAS with the intention of studying Chinese history because I have some roots out there in the past. But suddenly it smacked me in the face that this is our nearest neighbor as Europeans, and it's probably the culture that we understand the least. It's a very odd, there's an old story, an old novel actually by Anthony Burgess, the author of Clockwork Orange is what he's most famous for. But he wrote a series of books about Malaya, or Malaysia as it's called now. And in one of them, he has an ex-British Palestinian policeman who's out in the East. He's just arrived and he's drinking a beer with somebody and he's laughing at them, saying, you people think this is the East. Palestine is the East, my dear. And I understand exactly what Burgess meant. Culturally, there seems to be a massive divide between these two quite close-lying neighbors. We see Arabic influence in Spain. We see it with guitars. We see it with the type of music. We certainly know that Arabic learning introduced so many concepts and really sparked possibly the Renaissance in Europe. But still, in fact, we don't really sit pretty comfortably together, and we know very little about each other. So it really did spark my imagination when I was attending the school. And I decided to take that branch because obviously at the beginning you do Islam 101 and you do China 101 and so on. And this was the one I chose and really went. I actually have a joint degree. I'm also for the art and architecture of the Islamic world as well, which is a nice fit actually, because sometimes the history of the Islamic world, a little bit like medieval history in Europe, can just seem like a procession, ironically with the assassins, of murders of a king or losing a battle or losing a kingdom, then another king, then another king, then another king. It just gets a little bit confusing, and it doesn't seem to mean anything. It doesn't seem to have any large themes, not like perhaps modern histories where we see more ideology. I was thinking about the Cold War. Actually, I'm just writing the introduction to a book on the military orders of medieval Europe, and I was thinking about how do we actually get this message over that these individuals who seem so driven by religion that they seem like religious fanatics, whether they be assassins or whether they be Knights Templar, Knights Hospitalar, is that really any different to the way that we were prepared to go to the brink of nuclear war over two ideologies, essentially, whether that be capitalism and communism on one side, or call it what you wish. I don't know that communism ever really existed in Russia, but it was totalitarian. But certainly the world view was totally different. We were prepared to go to mutual destruction. So I think we have to have a little bit of understanding of what drives these people in the past. I've always found the medieval world fascinating anyway. Norman Cantor, a great scholar, once said that if you want a manual about how to reconstruct society after total destruction, look to the medieval world. Don't look to the Roman world. Don't look to the Greek world. Look to the medieval world. Because that period that we call the Dark Ages, the collapse and the end of the Roman Empire, they really had to reconstruct out of that. Now, there's Roman law in there, there's German poetry, there's Catholicism in there. It's three things for the Western world. In the Islamic world, certainly it's all about Islam. You cannot really describe the Near East without embracing with it, to a very large degree, the idea of the community, of the Ummah, the absolute restructuring of society that you see once everybody is following a religion that defines the world they're in. The Arab Empire ended very early, ended about in 860, and it ended not because it was conquered, it ended because of mass conversion. It wasn't even attempted, it just happened because the advantages, financial as well as social, of being a Muslim were massive. You could stay a Christian, you could stay a Jew, you could stay a pagan if you wished when the Muslims turn up and conquer Central Asia or they conquer Syria. But you're going to have to pay the jizya, you're going to have to pay a poll tax, you're going to have less rights, and you're also going to still have the restrictions of things like Ramadan and so on and so forth. So it was a cultural pressure, maybe a fiscal pressure too, because the jizya was not cheap, the poll tax. But this mass conversion was not sought by the Arabs. And when it happens, the Arab Empire essentially ends and you get the Islamic Empire with lots and lots of little Persian dynasties forming, but they have legitimacy because they're Muslims. So it's an interesting flick over of what looks like a conquest on ethnic basis, the Arabs coming out of the peninsula. And then what actually occurs is you kind of see a resurgence of Persia. You know, there's an old saying that Greece conquered Rome, Rome didn't conquer Greece, even though Rome clearly did conquer Greece because Rome took on so much of Greek culture. Well, the same kind of thing happens with the Islamic Empire. Persian styles are seen in North Africa. If you go, there's a great building, Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo. It's pure Persian. Pure Persian, the original oldest building with the crenellations and everything. It looks exactly like Persian building.
I have to say, I'm a big fan of Islamic art as well. I think it shows incredible symmetry and harmony and a lot of ideas that I think balance what you were saying in terms of the history of conflict and turning over. It's interesting, James. I want to pick up this a little bit later when we talk about organizational structure and some other things. But I'm curious, obviously you were interested in the boundary between the East and the West and, let's say, the Christian world and the Islamic world. Why in particular were you interested more specifically in the really pinpoint of conflict and where change ultimately flipped over with things like the Assassins and some of your other work on these guilds of knights in the Middle Ages, for example?
Yeah, I was once on a panel at the Emirates Airlines Literary Festival. I can't remember which year it was, but John Mann, who wrote a very great book, Genghis Khan, Life, Death and Resurrection, and Justin Morozzi were on the panel with me. And Justin Morozzi had just completed a book called Baghdad, I think, City of Life, City of Blood. So if you've got Genghis Khan on the stage and you've got Baghdad with its long and bloody history, some of which I've written about as well, and you've got me with absolutely slave soldiers, assassins, crusaders, somebody in the audience asked the question, what is wrong with you people? Why is it that because people are patriotic, right? Or they feel like you're attacking the culture, that this is just a culture of blood. Now, I say Genghis Khan, you've got to remember that Genghis Khan came straight through the Middle East, pretty much destroyed Persia. I mean, there are stories, Abu Shama, I think, a great Islamic writer, he said he could not bring himself to write about the Mongol Holocaust for 25 years. Friends asked him and made him do it. People were pulling plows because the Mongols had killed all the cattle. They destroyed the country. And actually, psychologically, I actually am convinced that this is one of the reasons, to use a very trite historical point, why the West has won. Why is the West there? Why isn't Islam number one anymore in terms of the Near Eastern lands? I think the Mongols have a large part to play in that. There are other issues as well. But it caused a psychological turning in. There was a crisis of confidence after the Mongols had been. Now, the Mongols converted to Islam, but really the damage had been done. The empire fell apart very fast for various reasons, but it really didn't leave behind very much as far as I can see. It damaged agriculture enormously too. Iran, I don't know if anyone's visited Iran, but you drive for hours between like Shiraz and Isfahan, you don't see much. It's very fertile in those little valleys, but the rest of it's very, very dry, very flat, because the irrigation system that used to be pulled has been destroyed. The same in Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, these giant rivers. It's fertile now for modern techniques, but it was destroyed overnight. And as somebody has pointed out, you can bomb German cities, but generally speaking, we can rebuild those things. But when you destroy an agricultural base, as the Mongols did, it really did immense damage. The desolation was massive. Sometimes people have doubted the numbers that are claimed in the chronicles, that the Mongols couldn't possibly have killed this many people. It would have taken them months and months and months, hacking their heads off with swords and all the rest of it. But that's the thing about terror, right? It's about scale. If everybody in your village, even if it's only got 9 people and it is dead except you, it's pretty terrible. I can't remember what the point of this question was.
How did you get interested in all the gore? And how did you get interested in the military side of the culture clash?
Yes, that was the point. That's the point. It's actually unavoidable. I mean, there's 2 types of people in the medieval world, men of the pen and men of the sword. And the men of the pen are usually clerics, whether they be Christian monks, whether they be Islamic theologians writing. But the sword basically makes politics. So it's pretty much unavoidable. I don't know that that's that different anymore either, to be frank. My girlfriend did say to me, because we put our 2 houses together not that long ago, she said to me, you seem to have a lot of books about war. And I said, no, those are politics books. Von Clausewitz was right. War is politics by other means. But what von Clausewitz really meant was politics has failed at this point. But then politics fails pretty quickly when you're fighting over physical resources. The other thing to say, of course, is, and Edward Gibbon was right, and he wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a country without any history is a happy one. Because most history is pretty miserable, right? if you don't have pretty nasty events like wars and famines and things, nothing really will be recorded. You find the same even in Chinese history, which is, I'm sorry, I wrote another book about the Chinese because once you get into the Mongols, you can't escape them. As a great tutor of mine once said at the School of Oriental and African Studies, you can't actually do anything in Asia without encountering the Mongols. So I was asked after I'd written about the Mongols in the Middle East to write something, a one-volume history of the Chinese resistance to the Mongols. And one thing you find, even with Chinese histories that are very touched up, very smoothed over, because each dynasty as it comes in wants to make itself look legitimate. So it doesn't say so many bad things about the last dynasty because it wants to feel like it's taking over in a seamless succession. But what you even find there is they're still recording typhoons, they're still recording locusts, they're still recording war, because these are the things, unfortunately, I think that history is made of. I mean, it's great that we do have other histories available. You know, we have some nice social histories coming out, and then we have some things on gender history. Gender history is pretty difficult in the medieval age, to be honest. There's not a lot of female activity. I can only think of one sultana in the medieval age who actually ran a kingdom, and she did not last very long, and amongst blood and intrigue. And I think that's great that we're starting to see those things. And to be honest, most of us live through history, but are not that impacted by it, perhaps. Again, coming back to the assassins, so what? They killed the Sultan. They didn't kill 3,000 people while they were doing it. It's not really going to make the headlines, but amongst the clique, amongst the people that really matter at the top of the running, it really was impactful. People were genuinely terrified of an assassin's blade. We have a great story from Saladin, one of the greatest Islamic rulers, that an Ismaili assassin, or let's call him Ismaili ambassador, came to see him from one of the castles in Syria, from one of the assassin castles, to say, stop operations, leave the area, don't besiege the castle. He said, I have a message for you, Saladin, this great sultan, but I will only deliver it to you in person with no one else in the room. Saladin laughed and said, these bodyguards never leave me. They're always with me. The ambassador then turned to the two bodyguards, they were two young men, and said to them, if I ordered you to kill this sultan now, would you do it? And they both said, command me now. So this was the problem too. It wasn't just the fact that the assassins killed people, it was the fact that anybody in your entourage, anybody in your bodyguard could potentially have been a convert, because their job was to be a sleeper, was to sit there for as long as was required taqiyya, this idea in Islam is called taqiyya, which means that you can deny your faith if you are in physical danger. This was utilized by the Shia. Remember, these are Shia, Nizari, Ismailis, a sect within a sect within a sect. So we have the classic, obviously, Sunni and Shia division, but within Shia, the assassins are a very, very small group. In fact, it depends which particular imam you're waiting to return on which particular type of Shia you are, so to speak. I won't go into too much theological detail because it's
well, it's always helpful to have.
For those in the audience or whoever might know the Druze in Lebanon, for example, the Druze are actually waiting for the 14th imam to return. Everyone else is waiting for the 11th. So work it out how you want from that.
I'm still
some people wait for the 7th as well. So.
Still catching up here, but something that occurs to me throughout this that I should probably really make a distinction about is that, for me, the interest in your work has really very little to do with the religious elements of it, the history of war itself, or in particular modern day terrorism, where you can obviously draw a lot of parallels to what had gone on in the past. What I really see interesting is especially your castle analogy early on in the discussion reminded me of my early days at Oxford doing the MBA in strategy class. And there was a problem put up on the board of, some resource restrictions and whether you would build a castle or some sort of a tent. And basically the same sort of decisions start to come into play. The castles seem to have their advantages, but of course, there's a flip side to every strategy that you want to figure out. And I think that's where it comes to me to what I'm really most interested in, which are really kind of related ideas to the whole concept that in so much of what we see now as modern business. A lot of these same principles of conflict, the way family business and succession operates, the individual actors, maybe not assassins, but perhaps change agents like entrepreneurs, for example, can really bring about change. And so I find it really fascinating to hear about your talk of especially the forces, the influences, the money, and the politics here. I don't know if you've said enough about the book itself. Is there anything else you want to just sort of paint the picture of the storyline or how you frame? Because there's been a lot of history you brought up in talking about what you do.
I might stretch the analogy a little bit, perhaps, but I guess if you took what you've just said, I would suggest that the entrepreneur, in terms of our story of the Ismaali assassins, are actually the missionaries. Because this was not like the Christian missionary work that we're used to seeing of trying to convert entire nations. If you think of the work in Africa in the 19th and early 20th century that occurred, and in South America and so on, they weren't really looking for that. They were looking for particular individuals who had very high intellect, because this was a very complex theology that they were trying to explain. In very simple terms, the Ismaili Creed states that there are secret verses within the Quran that can be understood by those who have special learning. So you undertake a relationship as one of these missionaries with people who are smart enough, who are literate, who are powerful enough in their community to give you the tithing and the financials that you need to get from them as well. And of course, they must be capable of understanding that quite complex message. You're not so interested in mass conversion and making sure that everybody comes and gets baptized and comes to mass every week and so on and so forth, more traditional, large-scale religious conversions, because what you find is those nodes, those individuals, have massive amounts of power by influence. Because further down the line, of course, you have got lay people who will say, I identify as an Ismaili assassin. But why is that? Because they're in a village that's being well run by an educated guy that looks after them, that is actually protecting them in some ways as well. Because one of the aspects of the Ismaili world as well is that, and I alluded to this slightly earlier, that the Arabic Empire ends pretty quickly. Pretty quickly. In historical terms, it ends in about 110 years from its outset, and we start to see these independent dynasties. But then, in 1055, you get the Turks. The Turks turn up from Central Asia. It's a huge movement of people, and they essentially conquer Islam. Now, they convert to Sunni Islam, but in a very functional way. They're essentially still Turks. There's a Syrian poet of the Crusades period. I can't actually remember his name. I think it might be Al-Jawali, but he's writing in the Crusades period about the Turks in Syria. And he says, my friends, they ask me why I don't go out so often. There's a bit of racism coming here, folks, so brace yourself. But, welcome to the medieval world. He says, my friends tell me, you don't go out anymore. We don't see you on the street. We don't see you enjoying yourself. He says, whenever I go out, what do I see? Monkeys on horsebacks. So this is an educated classical Arab, his view of these guys. But in a way, I can kind of understand it. Very heavy taxes, quite brutal, if functional and effective justice. But essentially, the state has become the army, and the army has become the state. It's a heavily militarized state. So the rights of peasants are pretty poor. So if you think about it, that actually makes an Ismaili headman of a village quite attractive, because if that castle that may be quite a distance away in Syria or in Persia has enough influence through the threat of assassination to keep those places liberated, if you want to call it that, that's pretty good. So the entrepreneurial missionary is doing that work, finding the right individuals, finding those people. And that's one thing we do know about the Ismaili lay followers. They're usually highly educated, the nodes, the very important people in their communities and societies, often merchants. And the other thing about Islam, of course, is that unlike Christianity, merchants have a very high level in society, in Islamic society. There was no rejection of the idea of commerce or making money in medieval Islam at all. Usury, yes. Lending money at interest, but there were complicated what shall we call them, legal fictions to get around that. Or, of course, there was a large Jewish community who were not, who were kind of exempt, essentially, like Christian Europe, from the rules of usury. And I use the term usury in terms of only lending money at interest, not high, terrible interest. But what you've got there is, as I say, merchants are highly ranked. Even in the Quran, there's much emphasis on good profit. Fair profit is great because you can give more back to the community. You can undertake charity work and so on and so forth. But there's not this idea of the rich man can't get through, the old Jesus Christ story. You can't get a camel through the eye of a needle. It's not like that at all. So these people are well respected. The other thing, of course, is merchants move freely. They move freely. So many of them become dais or missionaries of the Ismaili sect. The Islamic Empire was incredible in terms of the way that you could move freely across it. You've got a lingua franca. You've got Arabic. If you can speak Arabic even badly, you're absolutely fine. Even in Persia, it's going to be recognized. People will understand what you're saying. You can draw a check in Cordoba on a bank in Cairo, and you've got coinage that can be trusted. It's really got the backing of the government. The government is very pro-business, for want of a better term. There's an old saying in medieval Islam as well, there are two poles in the city, the market and the mosque. So getting those people, so I reckon, that's pretty much your entrepreneurs right there. In terms of the castle or the tent question, that's a pretty tricky one, really, isn't it? Because castles take a lot longer to build, but both the Crusader experience, because if anyone has ever seen Crusader castles in Syria or in Jordan, they're absolutely immense constructions, years to make, beautifully made, beautifully hewn stone and so on and so forth. But what that allows you is people settle underneath it. I was in Iraq a few years ago. I was in Erbil, and then I went to Israel shortly afterwards. And obviously I was thinking about the civil war that was raging in Iraq at the time. But then a few years later, I was in, and what you found in Erbil, because it was Kurdish, I had to go back to that story, because it was Kurdish, you found a lot of refugees just living there because they were shielded from the chaos that was engulfing Iraq. When the Syrian war kicked off, the safest place to be a Syrian was under the Golan Heights because the Israeli army was sitting up there with its field guns and artillery. So again, that's really the equivalent of a medieval castle right there. There's no Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. It's not going to go anywhere near the Golan Heights because all that power is up there. So I think the castle analogy, I'd go for the castle, not the tent. Possibly. Well, and then send my entrepreneurs out to do the business.
Well, I liked
rather than
your story. I like the satellite and hub story as well, because of course the castle provides a really solid center for the organization, and then out in the periphery you have these more flexible.
Again, the first assassin Grand Master Hassan Sabah, once he actually went to Alamut Castle, he never left. He didn't leave, I think, for 35 years. He died there.
Interesting. Why
he done his work
so safe, or he was retired?
He had such a great communications network that he was able to control castles in Syria. He was able to control assassinations in Cairo, and so on and so forth. How it was done in that age is a tricky one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about the Mongols, in particular, linking up the Middle East as one with their. I think it was. Hang on a minute, I can't remember the name of it. I only know the Arabic. It was the Pony Express, for want of a better term, to be honest. But we know that at Alamut they had messenger pigeons. We know also that they did have a courier system not dissimilar to actually be able to run between Syria and Persia. And later on, the Mongol Pony Express was adopted in the Middle East by the Mamluk dynasty, actually as the Barid, with a chain of horses and stables so that you could send messages very, very rapidly. And that was in a response to the long war with the Mongols that the Mamluks fought, in fact. But communications were pretty strong in the Middle East, but there were parts where it was a little bit dangerous to go. I'm writing at the moment about the Hospitalar Knights, and one of the things that comes up is that even after the Crusade and after the conquest of the Holy Land by the Crusaders, it was pretty dangerous to go on pilgrimage. It was still a good chance that you would be kidnapped, you would be murdered, you would be poisoned at a well that somebody'd set up, so you come with your horses and so on. So the Hospitalar Knights were built in a response to that. And Syria had been a pretty dangerous country since about 860 AD, about 900 AD. It started to really fall apart quite badly. So another thing about Islamic trade is that you had governments who were really, really invested in it. They were interested in protecting land routes because you might be bringing your camel train across all the way from the Persian Gulf, right across the top of Arabia, across Jordan, and then out through Agha, one of the Mediterranean ports. But equally, they protected Islamic shipping against Venetian pirates, Genoese pirates, Pisan pirates. The Crusades period sees the Mediterranean slip from Islamic control, and then you see the great Venetian Empire really becoming a thing in that period. Really was the birth of Venice, the Crusades period. But before that, Islam had very, very good control over the Mediterranean, and it was prepared. Governments were prepared to run expensive border defense of ports, but also to even go a little bit further and run regular patrols just to keep the pirates at bay, so that they could get their trade going, because Sicily obviously was part of the Islamic Empire at that time, part of the Fatimid Empire, but also it wasn't. I think we shouldn't see Sicily and Amalfi and places like that so much as Islamic possessions. Sicily certainly, because it was the jewel in the sea. But those other ports on the Italian coast and on the coast of Spain as well, and a little further up, as well as trading beyond that, were very much within the remit of friendly trade. We see fantastic articles of metalwork and woodwork coming into Venice. Even unfinished items, so that the family that bought it could put their own blazon on there, and then onward from there into Central Europe. And we see one of the things I really do like about Islamic art is when Islamic art has been finished by European goldsmiths and artisans. You see some beautiful rock crystal ewers from the Fatimid age, and then you see fantastic French filigree around here. And this is just such a lovely blend to see. It's delightful. But yeah, I think you've got governments who are heavily invested in trade as well, and are prepared to go the extra mile to protect these merchants because it's so vital to their trade. Of course, we get our French word douane for customs from the Arabic diwan, because you had to pay for these services, and you had to pay customs, you had to pay import and export duties, and that's how the state makes its money. And even the soldiers, even the professional soldiers, like the Mamluks, this most perfect soldier of the medieval age, he doesn't have a fief like a Western knight. He doesn't live on a piece of land and get his money off of the peasants. He lives in Cairo. So what does he get? His fief is a division of the trade of the state, and he's entitled to that for the service, military service that he gives to the state. But also, he doesn't have to manage it. A Western knight has to spend time on his land. He has to beat up the peasants and get the money out of them. The Muslim soldier doesn't have to do that. There's an office that sends him a check, essentially, and they do the collection for him.
Almost like how a Bitcoin miner gets paid for verifying transactions in their network. But the story earlier you were talking about with the Crusades and pilgrimages to the Holy Land, it really reminded me also of the sort of brave new world of the cyber universe and the whole threat of cyber insurance and protecting against these risks. That's something that I think the insurance industry is really starting to figure out more now, and I think skipping.
Well, that's probably a question then. If the Templar Knights were a charity, do you think there's? What I mean is there any value in government and other perhaps larger financial organizations maybe acting a little bit as a charity or as a policeman in that area? And I don't mean a policeman in a restrictive sense. I mean literally to help those. Who go where there may be dragons, right? Yeah. I don't know. As you say, it's an unheralded world. It would be nice to see a Templar Knight hospital somewhere in cyberspace that you could guarantee. You got white bread as well. I know. I read that the other day that the Templars, the Hospitallers were very generous. Generally, people are eating low quality brown bread with bits in it, black, and all that, but they always had white bread for pilgrims, which apparently was very expensive.
I don't know if we'll have time to get into the whole future of capitalism, but I think, with things like Black Lives Matter or re-examining the way we marginalize people in Western societies, I think people are recognizing that being charitable, or at least recognizing the potential in people in ways that maybe the monks of the past or some of these warrior monks might have thought about, is actually something that develops progress. And I think that's also the story of the history of insurance, which you touch on a bit in what you're talking about here.
I mean,
these are interrelated.
I've kind of drifted away from the country a little bit, but I did teach university for about 7 years in Shanghai. And one of the things that you saw at that time, even, and I think you see it even more now, and I think you see Xi Jinping reining it in, is the NGO type activity of Chinese money. I think Jack Ma has to be a little bit more careful these days than he did under previous leaderships. But I think that has had also a lot of people have looked to individuals like that in China for things like ecological projects rather than looking to the government, in fact. So I think you're absolutely right. And we think of the financial muscle of the American giants as well in those terms. Traditionally, I'm English. All you ever see is BP occasionally sponsoring an art exhibition, not too much else. Or maybe they do more, but you just don't notice it.
Well, something I wanted to touch on as well is you've mentioned the Knights Templar a number of times, and I'm based here in Switzerland, which has an interesting history when you get to know of it, of the founding fathers essentially being three, well-intended and organized warlords who made a network together, and that spread over the history through the mercenary business and all the way up to the global organizations that are based here now. I was wondering, first of all, if you can tell us a little bit more about some of those organizations like the Knights Hospitalar, Hospitalar, I can't say it properly, and Templar. How did they function in the Middle Ages, and what exactly were those organizations?
Well, I mean, I spent a few years in Geneva myself too, so I know the story of foundation and so on and so forth. But the other thing, obviously, about Swiss history is that ability to kind of just detach yourself from the Holy Roman Empire quite quietly without anybody really seeming to notice or care, as long as you were actually sending some money back down again. But that's a different story. In terms of, in terms of Templar Knights, Hospitalar Knights, and all of these kind of organizations, even down to the 1848 revolutions in Italy with secret societies, what you find, of course, is you find a group of like-minded individuals. There is a great scholar from the Islamic medieval world, Ibn Khaldun. There is even Ibn Khaldun chair of in Oxford University of it's a professor's seat for Islamic history, and Ibn Khaldun understood this very, very well, having lived in the Islamic world, because he saw what happened with many of these individuals that, as I was saying earlier, history sometimes can be just a succession of this clan came to power, then it fell, this household came to power, then it fell, and so on. But he actually tracked that kind of thing because he was very interested in the origins of movements, for want of a better term. And he came up with an Arabic word, which is asabiya. Very, very difficult to translate. Probably the closest thing to it is group feeling. And what he meant by that, and this may be a lesson for us in the 21st century as we begin to seem to diverge our opinions more and more and more into black and white, is however you may generally feel about something that you don't agree with this guy on, you have a group feeling. You do have a shared approach to things that gain for both of you. And I mean, maybe that's the thing that really comes out of that philosophy and that idea, is that you may have heterogenic views inside nations, inside organizations, and so on, but that group feeling of benefit, and that's what comes. He also argues that these type of group feeling organizations that are successful for a short period of time, and he studied the Fatimid Empire in this respect, they often run out of that one driving goal that holds them together. And again, not to go back to theology too much, but the Fatimid Empire was a Shia empire. It started somewhere in North Africa. It had a pretty rocky road to success, to be honest. It lost a few battles coming across North Africa, but eventually it conquered Egypt, and it was the founder of Cairo. Cairo literally means the victorious, and that was why they named it, because they'd arrived now. And not only did they have military success eventually, but they'd always had a driving idea of the Mahdi. This some of us will be familiar with the word Mahdi, this idea that there is an Islamic Christ-like figure that's coming back at the end of time, and that's when the resurrection is going to begin. Once they'd lost that theology, however, the dynasty went into decline pretty fast. And of course, Egypt, as we know today, it's not a Shia country, it's a Sunni Islam country. Yeah. And that was really his point, that you need something that binds people together. But if that loses its volition, then you're really, really in big trouble, and that's when it starts to break apart. And not to do too many America analogies, the day after the transition, but perhaps that's something that did occur for the last 4 years. People lost belief, not in democracy per se, but then that a democratic state could actually achieve the things that are important to me.
Yeah.
And that may have been, or a loss of the American vision for a short period of time, I hope.
A couple of weeks ago, I find it fascinating discussion, because a couple of weeks ago we spoke with a scientist who's written a book, The New Science of Narcissism, and part of the end of the discussion was about balancing the ego and the idea of self and other versus us. And I think exactly as you say, we can polarize and destabilize things, but the more that we can balance the forces within the greater thing,
so the question I would have had for him was, what do you appeal to then?
Genuine self-interest. I think that's the thing, is genuine value, as you were sort of saying. You have to, and this is a bit like how religion has evolved and now how religion has been replaced by science. What kind of storytelling can you captivate people with? Is it genuine narcissism? You've got a great story and people want it, or is it superficial and hollow and will be collapsed at some point sooner or later?
Well, my other real job, because history doesn't pay, I'm a health economist by trade. And one of the things that we know when we try to survey people is we know that there are a distinct group of people within every survey that you ever send out that will always tick the box to pay more tax and to have better health services and better air, but they don't really mean it. But they do like the idea of meaning it. So not to be cynical about it, but I don't know what is the next big thing that really drives us. We've been given in the Western world a tremendous amount of, well, I don't seem to have any, but they talk about a tremendous extension of leisure, although I'm not sure if that's true. Medieval people only worked about 186 days a year, so maybe we're getting a bad deal. But we, in theory, have got a lot of freedom because of the way our life is, and I mean freedom of the ability to go to places, not so much at the moment, but hey, the ability to be able to be in control of our own finances and so on, our own education if we wish. But have we actually lost the raison d'etre? I'm sorry about my incredibly bad French, 2 years in Geneva and still my pronunciation is terrible. But we've lost the reason for what we do and what we exist for, so to speak, and what do we do? I don't know. That's possibly a replacement issue. I do spend a considerable amount, as much time as I can, in Prague, and I didn't quite realize how strongly possibly the years of communism, plus maybe the Czech mentality, and possibly the history of Hussitism, I'm not sure, but it's an incredibly atheistic country. But I'm not entirely sure that they found anything to replace it with. And when I say religion, so I'm not sure, because even the culture and fabric of those areas that are Catholic seems to be disintegrating rather swiftly too.
Interesting. Well, I think we're coming up to the time we should probably be wrapping things up, and I wanted to
Sure.
focus in on things that are a little bit more current. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence and how the financial system of the world is being reshaped. There's successful entrepreneurs out there like Elon Musk who've been quite bold and seem to be rallying all sorts of people around them to work on space travel, artificial intelligence, and there seems to be a new religion around technology and its potential to go completely exponential. But then, beyond the COVID pandemic, we've heard this growing threat of a new East in China, and that's another topic you're very familiar with. I was wondering if you have thoughts on the current situation and how everything looks.
Well, as I say, I don't keep it quite. I think when you live there, and after a few years after you leave, you become what I call a China watcher, and you become quite fascinated by the movements and so on and so forth. And how will this happen? How will it evolve? Because it's quite a bizarre experiment, China, in some ways. Deng Xiaoping's reforms from 78, 79 unleashed internal migration of the like we've only really seen with external migration to the Americas, to North America. So it's an interesting case in that everything is essentially internal. The problem, as I feel that they really, really face, and it's going to sound very trite and very cliched, is perhaps the innovative angle is not quite there. I know that there's a tech crunch that they did experience very badly during the Trump period because of those blockages that were put on Chinese tech companies, which sounds a little bit back to front, I realize, because you think, well, Chinese tech company, they're trying to stretch the technology and they're being stopped by him. But what it was actually doing, and I think they may suffer with their politics with the Uyghurs as well in the West if the EU actually does do something quite strong in terms of sanctions, is the fact that they need tech input constantly. They need service industries that are quite largely in the United States and in Europe as well to feed in that inspirational spark, for want of a better term. And remember, I'm not a technologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that's maybe where they might suffer. The other question is whether the ecological disaster that I still believe is rolling on in China will overtake them to such an extent that it will distract and exhaust them. It's possible too. And that's been certainly rolling for about 20 years. I think the greatest issue that they actually have, and I'm quite prepared to be wrong on this because I threw a book away the other day, actually, that I read about 10 years ago called The Coming Collapse of China, which predicted it was going to happen in about 2 years after the book was published. And I threw it away, and I've probably had it about 10 years. So, predictions on anything is always a bit sketchy. But I think the issue they have, and Xi Jinping really, I think, is a reaction against this, as I said earlier about the NGO situation and the power of people like Jack Ma, is I don't know that you can have a fully developed free market economy, and I use that term very cautiously, or an entrepreneurial economy in a situation where the state, in very simple terms, cannot be sued, cannot be held responsible, and is not an element of the free market itself, because it cannot be, essentially. I think there was a scandal some years ago, and I cannot remember. I think I was still in China. The big head baby problem with powdered milk. That was the ionic construction of the feed or of the formula was such that you had a number of encephalitis issues and you had a number of baby deaths. It was very clear at that moment that the Chinese government could not be sued, and neither could that company, because it had a branch or an arm, or it had the protection of Chinese high officials. The other one that I always thought when I was in China that was interesting was the two-wife issue. Erway was meaning that gentlemen in Hong Kong had a wife on both sides of the border. So they had a wife in Shenzhen and they had a wife in Hong Kong. The Chinese government's solution to that was to prosecute him and put him in jail. That's not going to do the two wives any good, right? Or anybody, to be frank.
Yeah.
But what they couldn't allow, of course, under the strictures of Chinese and I don't really want to say law, I want to go more sort of constitution, but I'm not even sure if that's right, but let's say societal law, is they couldn't allow an individual the right to sue another individual. So they couldn't allow either of the wives to sue him individually because it just doesn't work under the structure of Chinese law. It's really quite difficult to get in to see Chinese justice. I did manage it a couple of times when I was in Shanghai. But when I was working there and we were given our handbooks for foreigners, we were basically given a law book, which was about as thick as a pamphlet. And really what that described was the rights of those who are arrested and so on and so forth. And it seemed very, very clear, but then you suddenly sort of recognize the fact that you had very little recourse when you were up against the state. You couldn't take out a counterclaim, for example. So I don't know whether that will impinge on Chinese expansion beyond where they are right now. I also wonder if the ecological impact is a double-sided blade too, because right now, you can buy a yoga mat for $5 that's made in China and shipped all the way across in a container ship. But I don't know if that is sustainable too, whether we're starting to see, because I seem to see this around, that there has been some repatriation of business, and not because of policies of people like Trump, but basically simply because it makes a little bit more sense to make it at home sometimes, or it makes a little bit more sense to not outsource, even when we're talking about perhaps more ethereal things like fintech, for want of a better term. It may make more sense to have that localized, certainly only because of my Prague connection. That's something that the Czech Republic seemed to have been cashing in on during COVID, that people were less interested in outsourcing it all the way to India and China and so on when they could get it inside the European Union, for example. That's, I'm just,
Yeah. Well, hey, I want to throw another curveball at you. So something I thought about in recent years, I remember reading the biography of Alexander Hamilton. And if you remember, he died by duel, which isn't quite an assassination, but kind of close.
Good old Bear.
He was settling his,
always good for a tale.
Exactly, and they've become much more famous thanks to the musical now. But it was the Ron Chernow book that I enjoyed so much. And
I like Gorbadell's book on Aaron Burr.
Oh, really?
My favorite. It's historical fiction, but it's fantastic because he's a beautifully colorful character.
But the point I was going to ask is, to what extent do you think outright murder or assassination has been replaced by let's say more virtual character assassination or reputational attacks on people? Because in the U.S. right now we hear the whole idea of politically correct culture and canceled culture, and in other situations we've seen how political smear campaigns can work. Do you think over time we've become more civilized in how we carry out these types of pointed attacks on our competition?
No, I think that's a different thing entirely, actually, to be honest. And again, not to mention another book that I've written, but I actually wrote well, I'm going to say true biography, but it's not. I wrote a military history of Vlad Dracula and the other individuals in the Balkans fighting the Turks. But the one thing about Vlad Dracula that I always remember was the fact that he was a duke, basically, of a small principality, Wallachia, and Wallachia had a lot of Saxons in it, had a lot of Saxon Germans in it. They were the richer individuals within it. The Vlachs generally were either soldiers, or they were peasants, or they lived in the mountains and herded sheep and so on. But the towns, the industrial towns in Transylvania and Wallachia, were Saxon German. And he persecuted them because persecuted maybe a bit strong. Well, he killed a lot of them and he put a lot of them on spikes and impaled them. He was pretty bad. I don't know the persecution's got more extortion, perhaps, might be closer to the word, because he needed funding. He needed funding for the Turkish war. He needed funding for his lifestyle as a warlord, etc. But what you see in that period is suddenly he's become the most famous nasty guy in the whole of Europe. Well, how did he do it? There were plenty of individuals. The propaganda potential of the wood printing was massive, because this story then just went the rounds. You've got societies that are becoming literate and in expanse. If you go a little bit further down the line, you come to the Hussites of Czech, of Bohemia back then, with the Protestant heresies breaking out, again, all to do with being able to print the Bible, being able to have access to the Bible. You didn't need a priest to have the Bible. You got an authorized version in Czech, in German, that does not require the Catholic Church. And then before you know where you are, what have you got? You've got the 30 Years' War. If you look at the character assassinations on the French nobility, the king and Marie Antoinette, in revolutionary France or pre-revolutionary France, entirely done by printed handsheets that were handed out all over about the queen was committing adultery, that she was having sex with her court musician, that she said, I don't think she ever actually said it, let them eat cake. But once it got out there as the message, you were done, really. So I think what we're seeing right now is the ability to do that. I don't know if we're wise enough. I think we are getting wiser to it, actually, but the degree of misinformation is very, very large. So I don't know that that is a completely modern phenomenon of the character assassination, because certainly, okay, maybe Vlad Dracula deserved it to be blackened, but he didn't probably deserve to end up being called a vampire, did he, to be honest, because, you know, there are other candidates. But, you know, that's what I mean. This kind of assaults on very fixed institutions, assaults on individuals have occurred. The technology has been there for sure, right from the printing press. The printing press is absolutely the key to the bloodshed across the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, the French Revolution. Is all driven by the American Revolution too, of course. You could disseminate the message about what George had done this week in terms of taxes and so on and so forth. In this age, yeah, I mean, I agree that you can, to a degree, destroy individuals, but equally you can grab a following a lot easier and you can keep that following. It will be interesting perhaps to see what happens with those individuals who've caused me a real pain in the ass, to be honest, the Brexiteers, the likes of Nigel Farage and the lot, who kind of pin their colours to Trump. Will they be able to reverse their position and so on? Will they have to? I don't really know. But equally with the group of individuals who have, I don't want to call them COVID deniers, but those who have gone against the ideas of lockdowns early on in this period, trying to make a name for themselves. You would think their reputations would be destroyed, even if they were people with powerful voices before, given the volume of death and this seemed to be the way that it is actually shaping up now. But I think the thing with what we see now, of course, is that you don't even have to worry about the dissemination of paper. You don't even have to worry if the newspaper that you're trying to influence people with is printed in certain locales, because you can have followers everywhere. You can have them in Pakistan. You can have them everywhere. I mean, I think that we saw that really with the Al-Qaeda phenomenon. It was called the base. And how did they manage it all the way from Afghanistan? Again, if you look at the leaders of that organization, the elders, they never left Afghanistan, but they were able to coordinate things, mostly on funding. You know, mostly you would go to Al-Qaeda with an idea and they would fund it or they wouldn't fund it. They weren't intricately involved in any of the attacks, even as complex as 9/11. It was more the base and the money, and that was the way that bin Laden set it up originally.
I didn't know they had to pitch for funding.
Really, he was not really ever rated particularly as a warrior per se when he was fighting in Afghanistan. He was really seen as a good organizer, and certainly somebody you could come to with an idea, and he would take on the funding of that and so on. And he was very good at organizing funding, and he came from a rich family, of course, as well, the bin Ladens.
So the story goes. Well, we don't have time to get into that huge topic, and that's not really the aim. But I think, thank you, first of all, James, because that was a fascinating discussion and even deeper than I expected things to go. Yeah, interesting to hear about how we can influence things, first of all, through the printing press. And I think now we would say it's social media. And about a year ago, I was in Davos and had the privilege to meet Brittany Kaiser, who was the center of the whole Cambridge Analytica controversy, which was behind both Brexit and Trump. So interesting to see how that will continue to develop. We're actually meeting a company that tries to solve some of that. It's called Centify, and they use social media data and compare, who you can trust and what's out out there in the noise to try and bring some sense to both sides of things. So looking forward to that. Before I let you go, though, James, can you say a few final words about what you're working on in the future and what we can expect from you?
Right now, it is the military orders. So in one volume, I wanted to bring in the Templars, the Hospitalars, the Teutonic Knights, as well as the smaller organizations in Iberia that really drove the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain from the Muslims. There is that. I have a conversation tomorrow with a Turkish TV channel, which sounds quite nice. They want to make a docudrama about Vlad Dracula versus Mehmed II, and that uneasy relationship, which is quite interesting dynamically in itself. And I think they would really be able to make something pretty good out of that. Apart from that, there's a book. I did create a book last year that we're just bringing to completion, The Crusades in 100 Objects, which really comes nicely with the elements of Islamic art. It's a bit of a careworn idea. The British Museum a few years ago introduced the history of the world in 100 objects, and then everybody kind of jumped on the bandwagon a little bit. But I think it was a nice opportunity to bring that whole period to the general reader with beautiful color illustrations. So you've got literally 300 to 500 words, not describing the object, but describing where the object sits within the history of the Crusades, and then the object itself. I mean, one of them, for example, was a customs post with some fancy customs hats and things to make it a bit more colorful. But what we were talking about was the fact that the financing systems that we see in Europe today really are drawing on that period of the Crusades, the Diwan into the Douan, into customs and so on and so forth. But also the opportunity to show some really beautiful objects and some fantastic buildings all the way across from Samarkand all the way across to Spain, because the Crusades period, as we were identifying earlier, there would have been no Crusades if it hadn't have been for events in the East, whether that be assassination or whether that be the Turkish invasions. It's really what was primed and right. So that was exciting. I think that will take a little while to get to publication. I think September this year. I should hopefully finish the military orders and the Knights of Christ, I think, was a working title. Probably going to change the end of this year. And it'll be interesting to see what comes up in this conversation tomorrow. One of the things about being a jobbing historian of quite odd, strange dynasties is you do get asked a few strange things. Everybody does seem to be fascinated by the Assassins, though, I must say. Whenever I've done TV documentaries, it's always been the Assassins. It seems to intrigue.
Not only gory and action-packed, but I think fascinating and intellectual and spiritual, even on some levels, and truly historic. But Dracula is always popular, and I guess that's a good part.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, they asked me tomorrow.
Conversation starter, being an expert on Vlad and Dracula. But I want to thank you again, James. It's been fascinating, and I hope we get a chance to talk further about some of the topics around maybe the Dark Ages or the Knights and some of the other things you're diving into, because I think they hold so much interesting insight about organizational dynamics and the framework behind the history and the events that we know so well. So thank you for joining us today and sharing that insight.
No, thank you, John.
Great. Take care.
Thanks.